My name is Alyssa Monroe. I was 31 years old, and what haunted me most about the night I nearly died was not the steady beeping of the heart monitor in the ICU, or the tearing pain in my chest as my body fought to hold on after the crash. What haunted me most was that my father did not ask the doctor whether I still had a chance. He asked only one question. How much does that surgery cost? I did not hear those words at the time, because I was in a coma then, my lungs badly damaged, my organs bleeding, lying still beneath the cold white lights of the hospital where I myself had once worked. But later, when I pieced together every account, every timestamp, every word in the records, I understood that on the night his daughter lay between life and death, my father did not go in to see me first. He went straight to the billing desk. Then, after hearing the number, he signed the "Do Not Resuscitate" paperwork with a calmness so cold it unsettled the staff, as if he were making a financial decision instead of facing his daughter's life. But even that was not the worst part. What still keeps me awake now is what happened the next morning. Believing I would never wake up, he began moving toward things that did not belong to him. My papers, my property, and anything he thought he could control before I opened my eyes again. And if you have ever had a moment in your life when the person who was supposed to protect you became the one who hurt you the most, stay with me until the end of this story. I truly want to know, if you were in my place, would you forgive them? Or would you never be able to look at them the same way again? And if stories like this speak to something inside you, you can subscribe to the channel and stay with me for the stories still to come. From the time I was very little, I knew the smell of antiseptic better than the smell of something baking in the kitchen. I remember those long, bright hospital hallways, the freezing plastic chairs, the patient names being called over and over, and my mother's hand tightening on my shoulder every time a nurse came out carrying another stack of forms. In my memory, childhood does not come back to me in summers or birthday parties, but in prescriptions, bills, follow-up appointments, and the heavy look in my father's eyes every time he saw an insurance envelope lying on the dinner table. There were certain things said so often in my house that they stopped feeling like words. They became nails, driven slowly into a child's mind until she believed they were the truth. My father would sit at the head of the table, set his glasses down, tap his finger against the wood, and say, almost always in that same voice, "Do you have any idea how much this family has had to pay because of you?" One time, when I was only 9, I asked my mother whether I could go on the school field trip that year. My father looked at me for a moment and said, "You should learn how to be grateful before asking for anything more." I did not argue. I never argued. I only nodded as if I had just been reminded of something perfectly reasonable. Ethan was different. My brother grew up under the same roof, but it was as if he lived in another world entirely. When he turned 16, my father took him out to the backyard, tossed him a set of car keys, and smiled in a way I almost never saw at home. When he got into college, the whole family went out to dinner at a steakhouse. My mother wore her nicest dress, and my father raised his glass in a toast as if all his hard work in life had finally bloomed into something beautiful. I sat there, smiling, clapping, and honestly feeling happy for him. At the time, I still was not old enough to name the sharp feeling in my chest. I only knew that when it came time for me to apply to college, my father set a stack of student loan papers in front of me and said, "You're an adult now. It's time to take care of your own part." But the saddest thing is that back then, I did not think I was being treated unfairly. I truly believed my father was right. I believed that from the day I was born, this family had been carrying something too heavy, and that I was that burden. I believed Ethan received more because he did not wear everyone down the way I did. And I believed that if my father was harsh, it was only because he had sacrificed too much. So I tried to live as lightly as possible. I did not ask for new clothes. I did not mention it when I was in pain. I did not talk about the nights I could not breathe. And I did not talk about the ache of seeing something beautiful and reminding myself that it was not meant for me. Maybe that is why it took me so long to understand that a child should not grow up feeling like she has to apologize for being alive. When I was little, I did not hate my father. I just tried to become a daughter who cost less. Less trouble. Less space. Less presence. And maybe that is why the only person who ever looked me straight in the eye, said my name with a gentleness no one else ever gave me, and made me feel like I was not a debt waiting to be paid, was June, my grandmother. June lived in an old wooden house on the outskirts of Columbus, on a quiet road lined with maple trees, where the fall leaves covered the walkway in red and the winter steps were always cold beneath your feet. The house was not big, and there was nothing remarkable about it from the street, but for me, it was the only place in the world that felt like a door truly opened because of me. Not out of duty, not out of pity, simply because I walked in. And she was happy to see me there. I would usually stop by after my shift, still in my scrubs, hair tied up in a hurry, shoulders aching, with a few bags of groceries in the car, her blood pressure medicine, maybe a loaf of bread, or some soup I had picked up on the way. She always heard my car before I even had a chance to knock. The screen door would open, and she would be standing there in that old cream-colored cardigan, one hand on the frame, the other resting lightly on her hip, looking at me as if I had just brought the sun with me to her porch. "You skipped another meal, didn't you?" she would ask, without even saying hello first. I would laugh and lift the paper bag in my hand. "I brought food. I asked whether you ate, not whether you brought food." I never once won those little exchanges with her. Her house always had its own smell: black tea, old wood, mild soap, and a trace of cinnamon lingering somewhere from the kitchen. The radio was usually playing softly in the corner of the living room. The knitted blanket draped over the back of the sofa was always folded neatly. The wall clock ticked at an easy pace, as if time inside her house moved differently from the world outside, kinder, wider, giving people enough room to breathe. Afternoons like that were usually very simple. I changed the porch light bulb, tightened the screws on the stair railing, checked her pill organizer, then sat with her at the kitchen table and drank tea. She never asked how much money I made. She never asked why I had not bought a house yet, why I was not married, why I worked so much. She would only look at me with those eyes that had grown old but had never confused what mattered, and ask, "Are you getting enough sleep?" Some days she would tilt her head, study my face for a moment, and say, "You're trying too hard to look okay." I would usually laugh it off, but she never let me hide. She would stir her tea slowly, as if giving me more time to be honest. "Alyssa, I'm asking for real. Has anyone ever truly been on your side?" The first time she asked me that, I was quiet for a long time. I looked out the window and watched the late sunlight falling sideways across the flower bed in the backyard. "I don't know," I said softly. "Maybe not." She did not answer right away. She only reached over and touched the back of my hand, so lightly, and yet so steadily. "Then remember this," she said. "A person can survive a great many things as long as they still know they are not alone." At the time I thought she was simply worrying about me in the way a grandmother does. I did not know she was seeing things deeper than anything I had the courage to say out loud. She saw how quickly I apologized. How I always said, "It's okay," before anyone else even felt guilty. How I made myself smaller inside my own family, like a guest trying not to inconvenience anyone. Some truths took me years to understand. She seemed to have understood them a long time before I ever did. The day before she died, she held my hand longer than usual. The skin on her hand was thin and cool, but her fingers still gripped mine with startling clarity. She looked straight at me, not confused, not distant, not like someone speaking final words through weakness. "If the day ever comes when the whole family turns their back on you," she said, so slowly that each word felt carefully set into place, "don't stand there begging them to believe you. Call Mr. Holloway." I frowned a little. "Mr. Holloway?" She nodded, then handed me a small old key darkened with age. "Keep it. Don't lose it." I held the key in my palm. It was so light it hardly seemed to weigh anything at all. "You're making me nervous." She smiled, but it was not the kind of smile adults give children to make them less afraid. It looked more like someone gazing very far ahead, very deep, as though she had already walked ahead of me into some place I had not reached yet, and was trying to leave behind a signpost before she went. "I'm not making you nervous," she said quietly. "I just don't want you to find yourself standing alone one day without knowing which door to open." The morning after she died, I still went to work as usual. I changed into my uniform, pinned on my badge, pulled my hair back, checked my schedule, and walked into my shift with the numbness of someone who did not yet fully understand what had just gone missing from her life. The days after that moved in a rhythm that felt familiar and empty at the same time. I still went to work, still drove home after dark, still stopped at the grocery store near the corner, still set my purse down on the kitchen chair the same way I always had. It was just that there was no longer a porch light waiting for me on my way home. Maybe that is why I started taking extra shifts. At first, it was only to stay a little busier. Then gradually I said yes to almost any schedule the hospital needed covered. Working was easier than thinking. Moving oxygen tanks, checking charts, watching monitors, hearing doctors call my name in those bright white hallways. In a hospital, everyone has something to do, something to save, something to keep from slipping away. There, I did not have to think too much about the emptiness inside me. The night of the accident was one of those nights. I had just finished a shift that ran longer than expected because an elderly patient went into respiratory distress right before handoff. By the time I left the hospital, it was almost dawn. It was not heavy rain, just the kind of quiet rain that blurs the windshield and turns streetlights into long yellow smears across a black, wet road. I remember turning the heat on low in the car, lowering the radio until it was barely there, and thinking vaguely that once I got home, I only wanted a hot shower and sleep straight through until afternoon. The traffic light ahead turned green when I was still a short distance from the intersection. Everything felt so ordinary in that moment that if someone had told me only seconds later my whole life would swing in an entirely different direction, I would not have believed them. I kept driving, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, eyes looking through the thin rain, and then from the left, a blast of white light came straight at me. There was no scream, no time to think, only a terrible impact slamming into the side of my car, metal shrieking and twisting as if the whole world had just been ripped open. I do not remember everything after that. My memory shattered into short, broken, distorted fragments. The smell of hot smoke, an unbearable pressure crushing my chest, feeling freezing cold even though it seemed like my blood was boiling. Someone leaning down close to me, a voice very near and yet echoing from somewhere impossibly far away. Somebody telling me to try to keep my eyes open, somebody calling my name. I think I tried to answer, I am not sure. Then everything sank into a thick darkness, silent in a way that felt terrifying. Later, almost everything I knew about that night came from other people. The ambulance brought me back to the very hospital where I worked. My co-workers received me. The people who had once stood beside me during emergencies were now running down the halls because of me. The doctors did one emergency surgery to stop the bleeding and keep me alive through the night, but my body was not stable. I kept bleeding internally. My lungs were badly damaged. The pressure in my chest was rising. They needed another procedure, more complicated, more dangerous, and they needed someone with legal authority to decide right away. The emergency contact in my records was still my father. Douglas Monroe arrived at the hospital in a dry coat, neat, unrumpled, unhurried, as though he had just stepped out of a late business meeting and not out of a car on the way to see his daughter hovering near death. He did not go straight toward the ICU. He did not ask whether I had regained consciousness. He did not ask whether I was in pain. The first thing he wanted to know was the prognosis. The second was the likelihood of recovery. The third was the cost. "What are her chances of survival?" he asked. The doctor answered carefully. "If she lives, will she recover fully? No one could promise that. How much will the next surgery cost?" And after hearing the number, he said something that made even people who had worked in medicine for years fall silent for a few seconds. No more extraordinary measures. Before the staff discovered that I had named a healthcare proxy, he pushed for a "do not resuscitate" order and signed the paperwork presented to him as next of kin without his voice catching. Without asking for more time. Without requesting to see his daughter one last time before making that decision. After putting down the pen, He even turned to the administrative staff and asked, in a flat voice so practical it was chilling, if she doesn't make it, who has the right to handle her personal property paperwork? No one answered my father right then. Not because they did not know the procedure, but because the whole room had just fallen into a kind of silence that is hard to name. In a hospital, people are used to panic, used to tears, used to families clinging to the last fragile percentage of hope. But calm that cold is rare. It catches people off guard. It makes everything in front of them feel wrong, as if the scene unfolding is not the one any decent person expected to see. Rosa Delgado was the first person to pull everything back into the right track. She was the head nurse on the unit, and she had been in the profession long enough to know when something was wrong, even when, on paper, everything looked technically valid. I had worked with her for years. She was not the kind of person who talked too much, and she never liked judging anyone too quickly. But she remembered exactly what each of her staff members had put in their records on the day they were hired, who was careful, who rushed, who forgot things, who never left a single box blank. And I was the last kind. When my father said I did not have a healthcare proxy, Rosa did not argue with him in front of everyone. She only looked at him for a moment, then turned away. But the second he left the desk, she went into the staff room, logged into the internal system, and opened my employment file. It took her less than 2 minutes to see the name sitting there, clear, complete, signed, dated, and electronically verified. Claire Bennett. Rosa told me later that she read the name twice to make sure she was not seeing it wrong. Then she reached for the desk phone, dialed the number on file, and held the receiver a little longer than usual, as if even she understood that the next few seconds might decide the rest of my life. Claire picked up almost immediately. Her voice was thick with sleep, rough and blurry, but after only a few words from Rosa, every trace of drowsiness disappeared. "Are you Claire Bennett?" "Yes. I'm calling from St. Matthew's. Alyssa Monroe was in an accident. She's in the ICU. Her file lists you as her healthcare proxy." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Claire asked, quickly and firmly, "How bad is she?" Rosa told her plainly. No softening. No circling around it. She said I needed another surgery. She said my father had just signed a do not resuscitate order. She said that if Claire could get there in time, that decision could be overturned. "I'm leaving now," Claire said. Not, "I'll try." Not, "Give me 10 minutes to think." Just, "I'm leaving now." It was still raining that night. Claire drove through the dark all the way from Dayton to Columbus across the wet black highway, carrying the copies of the paperwork she had kept all those years. She had been my best friend since college, the one person who had seen all the parts of me I always tried to hide inside my family. She knew there were things I had told her in words and things I had never said, but that still showed in the way I went silent. She knew I had not left my father as my emergency contact because I trusted him. I had left him there because I was too tired to keep fighting about it. Claire arrived at the hospital deep into the night. She signed the forms, overturned my father's decision, confirmed her authority, and the doctors immediately began preparing for the next surgery. But Rosa did not stop there. She opened an internal incident report and recorded every timestamp, every sentence, every detail exactly as it had happened. The time my father arrived. The time he signed the order. What he said to the doctor. The fact that he falsely claimed I had no healthcare proxy. Then she checked the hallway cameras and saw that my father left the ICU area less than 10 minutes after signing. He did not stop outside my door. He did not look through the glass. He did not ask one more question. My father went home that night, acting as though by morning I would be gone. And he could begin the part that really mattered to him. During the weeks I drifted in and out of consciousness, the world outside the ICU doors kept moving in its usual cold way. The machines kept beeping, shifts kept changing, rain turned into sun and then back into rain, and somewhere beyond the hospital, my father was not sitting by the phone waiting for an update from the doctors, the way an ordinary father would have. He was busier than that. Later, when every piece of paper, every record, every phone call was strung together, I understood that while my body was still being held one breath at a time by a ventilator, Douglas Monroe had already begun treating my life like an abandoned house, just waiting for somebody to come change the locks. June had never talked much about money in front of me. She was the kind of person who believed love should not be measured by what someone leaves behind after they are gone. But she was also clear-minded enough to understand that some people only show their true nature when they think no one strong enough is left to stop them. Before she died, she quietly arranged everything with great care. Her house, a small trust, and enough savings that if one day I wanted to stop, slow down, and live a life that did not leave me so exhausted, I could do that without asking anyone for permission. My father vaguely knew that June had assets, and in his own selfish way, he had always believed that if she left anything behind, it would eventually flow toward him. Maybe that is why, when he realized most of it had been left to me, he did not see it as his mother's final wish. He saw it as a mistake that needed to be corrected. The first thing he did was block the flow of information. Letters from the law office, legal notices, estate documents, everything that should have reached me was redirected, withheld, or disappeared in ways no one would notice unless they looked very closely. He knew my habits too well. He knew I lived alone, worked shifts, and often overlooked small details when I was tired. He knew that if he pushed everything just far enough out of my sight, he would buy himself time. Then came the forged signatures. I did not witness any of that, of course, but I had known my father long enough to picture the expression on his face as he sat down at a table, spread out the papers in front of him, and frowned the way he always did when dealing with something annoying but necessary. He had kept too many copies of my signature over the years, old records, insurance forms, applications I had signed when I was too young to understand why he wanted duplicates of everything. All he needed was one person willing not to ask too many questions. One stamp in the right place, one explanation smooth enough to glide past suspicion, and he could create a power of attorney that looked legitimate to anyone on the outside. After that, everything moved faster. Control of the house was transferred out of my name. The property was leveraged. Cash was pulled out of something that had never belonged to him. Later I learned it was not just greed in the moment, but desperation. My father was buried in debts no one in the family ever talked about. Failed investments he described as short-term opportunities. Personal loans hidden behind his calm appearance at church and those firm handshakes with the neighbors. The image of a man who had sacrificed all his life for his family turned out to have been built with great care, like a clean front porch hiding a rotten foundation underneath. Ethan was not the one who signed the papers or called the lawyers. My brother did not do the messiest parts with his own hands. But he knew my father was handling a few things. He knew documents were being processed. He knew something was happening far too quickly while I was still unconscious. And he chose the easiest and the cowardliest thing: not to ask. In many families, betrayal does not begin with one grand act. It begins with a very convenient silence. One person sees something wrong but tells himself it is better not to get involved. Another understands that silence will benefit him, or at least spare him from having to face the truth. Ethan stood exactly there. Not clean, but not brave enough to become fully dirty. Just still enough to let the wrongdoing keep moving forward without resistance. I woke up one afternoon with pale white light slanting through the ICU blinds, the kind of cold, flat light that makes every hour in a hospital feel the same. At first I did not understand where I was. My throat burned as if it were full of sand. My chest felt so heavy that even a single breath seemed like trying to force open a rusted door. I blinked a few times, looked at the ceiling, looked at the line in my arm, then saw Rosa standing by the window, arms folded, her face tired but steady in the way people look when they have watched over someone too long to dare hope out loud anymore. When she saw my eyes open, she did not rush to me. She only came over, pulled up a chair beside my bed, and said very softly, "Welcome back." I wanted to ask how long it had been, but my lips were too dry and my voice came out as nothing more than a broken breath. Rosa understood. She gave me a little water on a sponge, waited until I could swallow some of it, then said, "Almost 3 weeks." 3 weeks. The number did not fit inside my mind right away. It hovered in the air, too big, too far away, as if it belonged to somebody else and not to me. I turned my head slowly, my whole body hurt. Who? I started, then stopped. Who's been here with you? Rosa asked. I blinked. She nodded. Claire. As if she had heard her name, Claire appeared in the doorway. Her hair was thrown up in a rushed bun, there were dark circles under her eyes, and she was wearing the gray sweater I had seen her in years ago, maybe from some other night she had never really gotten to move on from. She came to the bed, leaned down, and hugged me as carefully as if I might break in her arms. You scared me half to death, she whispered, her voice completely unsteady. I closed my eyes for just a second. No mother, no Ethan, no father. A few hours later, once the pain medication cleared some of the fog from my head, Rosa told me everything. Piece by piece. Very slowly. Very clearly. Like someone unwrapping layer after layer of bandaging from a wound while knowing it would hurt more underneath. She told me my father had come only once, on the first night. She told me he had signed the do not resuscitate order. She told me Claire was the one who had authorized the surgery that saved my life. I did not interrupt. I did not cry either. Some truths do not make a person break apart right away. They just make her cold. Claire sat beside me, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone completely cold. That's not all, she said, not looking at me. While you were still out, he called a few times, asked when he could pick up your phone, then your laptop, then your paperwork. One time he even asked where the key to your apartment was. I turned to look at her. He asked that? Claire nodded, lips pressed tight. I told him nothing was leaving unless you approved it. He wasn't happy. Right then, it was as if someone lightly touched an old drawer in the back of my memory, and June's words came back. If the day ever comes when the whole family turns their back on you, don't beg them to believe you. Call Mr. Holloway. I could almost feel the little key she had given me resting in the bottom of my purse, heavier now, as if it had been patiently waiting for this exact day. I asked Claire for my phone. My hands were so weak I had to hold it with both of them just to press the numbers. Martin Holloway answered on the second ring. His voice was low, composed, not surprised but not cold either. When I said my name, he was silent for one short beat, then said, "I've been expecting your call." He confirmed everything faster than I expected. June had arranged the legal documents very clearly. I was the lawful beneficiary. Some letters from his office addressed to me had been returned under highly suspicious circumstances. And in the exact period while I was in the hospital, a few transactions involving the estate had appeared that could not possibly have happened without unauthorized interference. I lay there with the phone at my ear and felt as if the air in the room had changed. Up until then, some part of me had still been clinging to the idea that my father was merely cruel, merely afraid of the expense, merely unable to face something too heavy. But what Martin told me tore apart the last thin strip of illusion I had left. This was no longer a cowardly father shrinking from hospital bills. This was a man who, when faced with the possibility of his daughter's death, seemed to see an opportunity before he saw a loss. For the first time in my life, I understood that in my father's eyes, I was no longer a daughter to be protected. I was something to be controlled. Martin came the next morning, so exactly on time that I had the strange feeling he was the kind of man who had never made anyone wait one extra minute in his life. He wore a simple dark gray suit, a muted tie, and carried an old leather briefcase that had clearly been cared for well. When he entered the room, he did not bring the restless energy people usually carry when they are delivering something important. Instead, he brought a kind of calm that felt almost unusual, like someone who had seen the storm coming from far away and was now simply arriving to lay the map in front of me. "Do you feel strong enough to talk, Alyssa?" he asked. I nodded. "I think so." He sat in the chair beside my bed, opened his briefcase and placed a small dark blue metal box on the blanket over my legs. It was not new. The paint had worn away at the corners with age, but the lock on the front was still solid. The second I saw it, my heart skipped a beat. I knew what it was, even though I had never seen it before. Some objects carry a sense of familiarity, not because you have touched them, but because they were mentioned to you in a moment too deep to forget. Martin looked down at the box, then back at me. June left it in a safe deposit box at the local bank under a trust arrangement. She instructed that it be given only to you, or opened in front of you if you could not come in person. He paused. I think it's time. Claire stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, perfectly still. Rosa was there too, near the door, as if she did not want to intrude on something so personal, and yet had no intention of letting me face it alone. I reached into the little bedside drawer where Claire had put my purse the night before. It took me a few seconds to find the old key June had handed me that day. It sat in my palm, cool, tiny, so light it was hard to believe it could open anything large enough to alter a person's life. When I slid it into the lock, my hand trembled a little. Not from weakness, because I knew that after the small click about to come, there would be no way back to uncertainty. The lock opened with a dry, ordinary click, almost disappointingly simple compared to everything it had been holding inside. On top was a cream-colored envelope, and I recognized June's handwriting immediately, thin and careful, just like her voice. Beneath it was a stack of documents arranged in order and tied with a red paper band. Copies of the trust, certificates, transfer records, signature comparisons from different points in my life, and a smaller envelope with Martin Holloway's name written in dark blue ink. I opened June's letter first. The paper carried the faint old smell of dry wood and drawers that had been closed for years. I had to take one slow breath before I could read the first line. Alyssa, if you are reading this letter, then things have probably happened exactly the way I feared they would. I stopped there, my eyes stinging. Martin did not rush me. Claire did not touch me. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft rhythm of the IV beside me. I kept reading, slowly, line by line. She wrote that for years, she had quietly paid off debts for Douglas that he never admitted to. One time it was after a failed investment scheme. Another time it was high-interest borrowed money used to fill a hole he called a temporary difficulty. Then once again, when he came dangerously close to having his name tied to something serious enough that the entire church where he stood reading scripture every Sunday would have looked at him differently. She wrote that every time he promised he would change, and every time all he really learned was how to hide himself better. There was one sentence I had to read twice before I could trust my own eyes. Your father is not afraid of losing money as much as he is afraid of losing face. If he harms you and then moves too fast, it means he has been waiting for this chance for a long time. I lowered the letter. Something inside my chest hurt and cleared at the same time. It was not the pain of learning one more cruel truth. It was the feeling of finally seeing the full shape of the thing that had been pressing down on my life all along. June had not only understood my father, she had prepared for the day he would reveal himself. Only then did Martin open the envelope addressed to him. He skimmed it, then set the page down and slid it toward me. June left very specific instructions, he said. She required me to keep separate samples of your genuine signature for comparison in case there was ever a dispute. She also stated clearly that if Douglas tried to interfere with the estate with unusual speed, I was to treat that as fraud, not family confusion. I looked at the stack of documents in front of me. The notarized copies, the dates, the seals, my genuine signatures beside forged ones that would likely fall apart the second someone examined them closely. Nothing was intuition anymore, and nothing was just an emotional story retold from one person to another. It had become something solid. Paper, ink, a timeline, a straight enough line to follow all the way through. Claire stepped a little closer. You don't have to guess anymore, she said softly. She was right. For the first time since I had opened my eyes in the ICU, I was no longer buried beneath the wreckage of confusion. I was still in pain, still weak, still unable to walk normally. But I was no longer just the person who had been betrayed and was trying to understand what had happened to her. I had evidence. I had a lawyer. I had people standing in that room who were not asking whether I was worth protecting. They were simply staying because they knew I was. I folded June's letter carefully, placed it back on top of the stack of documents, and looked up at Martin. When I spoke, my voice was still rough, but it did not shake anymore. He thought I was never going to wake up, I said. Now I want to know how far he got. Martin nodded once, very slightly. Then from this point on, we do not react, we prepare. The church's annual fundraiser was held on Saturday night in the large fellowship hall behind the chapel, where every year they hung the same strings of warm yellow lights, spread the same cream-colored tablecloths, and filled the air with the smell of coffee, baked goods, and meat gravy before the speeches began. I had been there more times than I could count, sometimes helping set up chairs, sometimes carrying trays of food, sometimes simply sitting quietly in the corner, listening to grown-ups talk about kindness, family, faith, and sacrifice, as if those things always belonged together. That night, I walked in more slowly than I ever had before, one hand lightly resting on the back of a chair for balance, my side still throbbing with each breath, and I could feel the heads turning toward me almost all at once. A few people lifted their hands to their chests. Someone softly said my name. A woman I had known since childhood came over, hugged me very carefully, and said in a trembling voice, "Seeing you here really is a miracle." I smiled, thanked her, and kept walking farther in. At the front of the room, my father stood beside the small stage in a dark blue suit, shoulders straight, chin lifted just enough, wearing exactly the look of a man accustomed to being trusted. When he saw me, his face brightened instantly, not with the startled look of a man who thought his daughter was still recovering somewhere else, but with the perfectly timed emotion of someone who knew how to use every scene God placed in front of him. "Alyssa," he said as I came closer, reaching out to hold my elbow like a gentle father in front of everyone. "I'm glad you made it. Everyone's missed you." I looked at his hand on my sleeve for one brief second, then answered softly, "I thought I should be here tonight." He nodded, his eyes flicking to my cheek where the bruising had faded, but not disappeared. "Don't stay on your feet too long," he said, loudly enough for the people around us to hear. "You're still weak." I only smiled. Yes. When it was time for the speeches, my father stepped onto the stage to the familiar sound of applause. His voice rang out steady and warm, placed exactly where it had always moved people. He spoke about trials, about faith refined through pain, about nights the whole family had knelt in prayer for me. At one point he paused, laid a hand over his heart as if gathering himself, and looked down toward me with a thin, sorrowful smile. "There are moments," he said, "when a father can do nothing but stand beside his daughter's bed and beg God to keep her here." The entire room fell silent inside the soft emotion he was so gifted at creating. I heard a few sniffles near the front tables. Then he extended a hand toward me. "Alyssa is here with us tonight," he said. "And if you feel strong enough, sweetheart, would you like to come say a few words?" All eyes turned to me again. From the outside, it must have looked like the kind of healing moment a church community loves best. A father with a shaking voice inviting his daughter forward into the circle of grace after a tragedy that had nearly taken everything. I stood up, walked slowly. Every step still pulled a dull pain under my ribs, but pain was something I had already learned how to move with. When I took the microphone from my father, it was still warm from his hand. I did not turn to look at him right away. I looked down at the familiar faces in front of me, people who had watched me grow up, who had brought soup to the house when I was sick, who had sat only a few pews away from my father every Sunday and believed they understood my family as a decent family. "Thank you all for praying for me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was clear. "I know everyone here thinks this is a story about a miracle." I paused, tightening my fingers around the microphone. But before this story goes any farther, I need to correct one detail. My father stood just behind me, very close. I could feel all of his attention shift fully onto me. "My father was not standing beside my hospital bed that night," I said. "He was standing at the billing desk, asking what my life would cost." The air in the room changed instantly. Not noisy, not chaotic, just that sudden kind of silence that appears when a room realizes it has walked straight into a truth that was not on the program for the evening. I turned and looked at my father then. For the first time since I had walked into that hall, his smile could no longer hold its shape. After that night, my father did not collapse the way people imagine when they hear a story like this. There was no dramatic moment of him dropping to his knees in the fellowship hall. No tearful confession, no midnight phone call saying he had been wrong and asking for another chance. Everything happened more slowly, more quietly, and because of that, more truthfully. Some things in life do not shatter in one loud crash. They crack line by line until there is nothing left solid enough to hold them upright. On Monday morning, Martin called me before 9. His voice was as composed as ever, but I could hear a slight edge beneath it. "The bank has frozen the loan," he said. "Their legal department received notice of the dispute over ownership." I was sitting at the kitchen table in Claire's apartment, both hands around a cup of tea that had already cooled some, watching a thin stripe of sunlight fall across the wooden surface. "That fast?" I asked. Martin said, "Places like that do not respond because of morality, Alyssa. They respond because of liability." I understood. And strangely enough, that made me feel safer. Once the truth had reached money, documents, and legal responsibility, it was no longer something my father could steer with a calm voice or a well-timed expression of grief. By that afternoon, the court had accepted the filing challenging the fraudulent transfer. A few days later, the police opened an official investigation into forgery, financial fraud, and the unlawful exploitation of property belonging to a person who had been incapable of making decisions for herself. Every line in those documents was cold, concise, and emotionless. But sometimes that emotionlessness is what justice looks like. It did not care who had been the model father at church. It did not care who read scripture every Sunday morning. It did not care whose voice made people trust him. It cared only about who signed what, when, how, and who benefited from it. The church responded more slowly than the bank, but not so slowly that my father had time to rebuild his image. The board asked him to step back temporarily from all leadership roles while the matter was being reviewed. The wording sounded polite, almost kind, but everyone understood what it meant. People began looking at him differently. No one argued in the parking lot after Sunday service. No one stood in the lobby pointing fingers. But it was the small changes that made a person understand he no longer had a place. Handshakes became shorter, greetings became less frequent. Conversations stopped the moment he walked up. Customers who used to call him to fix plumbing, check furnaces, replace pipes in their basements, started canceling their appointments, one by one. The rumors spread through the community faster than any sermon my father had ever delivered from the front of that church. Not because people were cruel, but because stories about morality travel farthest in places that think of themselves as decent. Someone heard something from a person who had been in the room that night. Someone else learned more about the bank. Then the police. Then the paperwork. Each person added one more piece, and before long, the full picture was laid out in front of everyone. I did not have to do anything more to ruin him. I only stopped covering the rest of him up. My mother came to see me about 2 weeks after that night at church. She called first, her voice small and tired, asking whether she could stop by. I said yes. Claire was at work when she arrived, so the apartment was quieter than usual. My mother wore her familiar brown coat, her hair brushed neatly, her purse clutched close to her body, as though she were entering a stranger's home and not the room where her daughter was recovering. She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped together. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, very softly, she spoke. I didn't know it had gone that far. I looked at her. "You didn't know all of it," I said. "Or you didn't want to know?" She lifted her eyes. There were tears in them, but they did not fall. "Alyssa, your father is a very difficult man." She stopped, as if her whole life she had grown too used to finding gentler words for things that should have been called by their real names. "He always made the decisions. I was only trying to keep this family peaceful." I listened to that and felt no burst of anger anymore. Only an older, more tired sadness. "You thought silence kept this family peaceful," I said. "But a lot of the time silence only keeps the person causing the harm peaceful." She lowered her face. I knew she was not the one who signed those papers. She did not call the bank. She did not hold back the mail. She did not ask who would handle my property if I died. But she had spent years beside a man like my father and chosen to call fear harmony, avoidance sacrifice, and silence love. I sat there looking at my mother and understood something costly and final. In a family, betrayal does not always wear the face of the person doing the damage. Sometimes it wears the face of the person who knows, and still sets the dinner table, as if nothing is happening. In the months that followed, everything kept slipping out of my father's hands in ways he could not stop. His lawyer negotiated a settlement. Assets were sold. Debts had to be paid. Shortfalls surfaced. The price of all those years of preserving appearances had finally come due. No one told me directly about the moment he realized he no longer had control, but I think I can imagine it. For men like my father, losing money was never the greatest fear. Losing the power to decide other people's lives was what they could not bear. As for me, I moved into June's house one late autumn afternoon, when the maple leaves had begun collecting in thin drifts over the porch steps. Martin handed me the key at the door, then left so I could have time alone. The house was not large, and it did not look anything like the houses people dream about in design magazines. The wood floors creaked lightly in a few places. The paint around the window frames had aged. The kitchen sink had a long scratch in it that June must have grown so used to seeing she no longer noticed it at all. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt something I had not felt in years. I did not need to apologize for my own existence. I set my bag down on the floor, walked slowly through the living room, touched the armchair by the window, looked at the lamp, the bookshelf, the knitted blanket folded neatly over the sofa arm. Everything was simple. And everything told me, in a very quiet way, that I was allowed to be here. No one was tallying up the cost of each breath I took. No one was looking at my exhaustion and turning it into a debt. No one was asking me to make myself smaller, so I would be less bothersome to them. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, drinking tea from June's old mug, listening to the wind brush the windows. There was no miracle that healed every wound inside me overnight. My ribs still hurt when the weather changed. I still flinched when the phone rang too late at night. There were still moments when I stood in front of the mirror and realized my face had changed simply because I had learned too much about the man who helped bring me into this world. But inside all that loss, one truth had finally settled in me, clear and no longer ashamed. I used to think surviving was something I owed my family. But it turned out that surviving was the first time I ever got to live as someone who no longer belonged to their fear. Maybe that is what I think about most now, after everything. Not everyone who leaves your life leaves behind the same kind of emptiness. Some leave pain behind. Some leave a lesson you cannot ignore. And some, only once, they no longer have the power to frighten you. Allow you to finally understand how hard you had been bracing yourself all those years just to stay alive. I am not telling this story because I think I am stronger than anyone else. I am telling it because I know there are so many people out there who have sat quietly inside their own families, who have wondered whether their pain was big enough to deserve a name, who have spent years learning how to believe that they were not too sensitive, not selfish, and not wrong for wanting to be treated with kindness. So, I have a question for you, and I truly hope you answer it honestly. If your family called you tomorrow after years of silence, what do you think they would say? Help me, or I'm sorry. And how would you answer? Leave your answer in the comments. I read those comments very carefully, and a lot of the time in someone else's story, we end up seeing our own hearts more clearly. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about loss, boundaries, truth, and the way people find themselves again after things that seem impossible to survive, you can subscribe to the channel and keep walking with me. There are more stories waiting in the description too. Maybe one of them will reach the exact place inside you that has been silent for too long. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I'll see you in the next story.